For a moment, Gary Oldman and Uma Thurman looked like the kind of Hollywood couple that seemed almost too perfect to be real. He was the intense British actor whose performances could turn darkness into art. She was a young, striking actress on the edge of becoming one of the defining stars of her generation. Then, almost as quickly as their romance began, it disappeared. Years later, the story became even stranger. Thurman would describe the marriage as a mistake and remember it as a crazy love affair that ended as it needed to. Oldman, speaking about the relationship years afterward, was even more dismissive, saying he did not think it meant very much to either of us. Those words are difficult to ignore, especially because the marriage had once seemed so intense. But the real story is not simply that two famous actors married young and divorced quickly. It is about timing, ambition, youth, addiction, Hollywood pressure, and two people whose lives were moving faster than either may have understood. And to understand why the relationship burned out, we have to go back to the moment they first met. In 1989, Oldman was already an acclaimed British performer, known for his raw intensity and unconventional screen presence. Thurman was only 18 when they met while working around the film State of Grace. According to accounts from the period, the connection was immediate. Oldman was roughly 12 years older, and Thurman later recalled that she had little romantic experience when the relationship began. Their romance developed with remarkable speed. Oldman had recently separated from actress Leslie Manville, with whom he had a young son, Alfie. By 1990, Oldman and Thurman were married. They were not merely another celebrity couple passing through the tabloids. They were two ambitious actors trying to establish themselves while living inside an industry that rewarded intensity and often blurred the boundary between performance and real life. For Thurman, the relationship carried the weight of a first great love. She later said exactly that. But first love can feel permanent precisely because there is nothing earlier to compare it with. At 18, the difference between passion and permanence can be almost impossible to see. Oldman's career was accelerating too. He was moving toward major American roles, including JFK, while Thurman was building the reputation that would soon lead to films such as Pulp Fiction. Their marriage existed during a period of enormous professional transition for both. Then came the first crack. The relationship that had moved so quickly began to unravel just as quickly. By 1992, the marriage was over. From the outside, the divorce created a simple narrative. Another Hollywood romance had failed. But years later, both stars would offer clues suggesting something more complicated. Thurman's description was brutally honest. Oldman's was remarkably detached. There was also another reality beneath the glamour. Oldman was struggling with alcohol during this period, something he would openly acknowledge in later years. He has said that his drinking became destructive and that sobriety eventually changed his life. That does not prove alcohol caused the Thurman divorce, and the public record does not justify reducing their marriage to one explanation. What it does show is that the young couple were navigating pressures far more complicated than the photographs suggested. The marriage was brief, but its shadow lasted much longer for both. And that raises the question that still surrounds their brief marriage. If the love had once been powerful enough to become a wedding, why did both eventually speak about it as though it had barely belonged to them at all? By the early 1990s, both Gary Oldman and Uma Thurman were entering a period that would define their careers. But behind the photographs, the premieres, and the growing attention surrounding their names, their private lives were becoming increasingly complicated. What looked from the outside like a glamorous Hollywood marriage was unfolding at a time when both were still trying to understand themselves, their ambitions, and the pressures that came with being young performers in an unforgiving industry. Oldman was building a reputation as one of the most fearless actors of his generation. He had already earned attention for Sid and Nancy and Prick Up Your Ears, and Hollywood was beginning to recognize that his intensity could become a powerful screen weapon. He had a presence that could be unpredictable, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. Thurman, meanwhile, was developing from an unusually mature young actress into someone directors were watching closely. She possessed a distinctive screen presence and an ability to appear both vulnerable and commanding, qualities that would eventually become central to her career. Their marriage existed in that strange space between private romance and public fascination. They were young, talented, beautiful, and surrounded by an industry that could make ordinary relationship problems feel enormous. Every appearance could become a photograph, every disagreement could become speculation, and every decision could be interpreted through the lens of celebrity. Behind the glamorous image, however, they were simply two people trying to navigate a relationship while their professional lives were beginning to accelerate. But there was a fundamental imbalance in their experience. Thurman had entered the relationship at 18, while Oldman was 12 years older. She later emphasized that he was her first love and that she had no previous romantic experience. Looking back, those details mattered because the person who enters a marriage at 18 may not be the same person who emerges from it at 22. Those years can bring enormous changes in confidence, identity, priorities, and understanding of what a person wants from life. The relationship also unfolded while Oldman's drinking was becoming a serious problem. Years later, Oldman was unusually open about his addiction. In a 2021 interview, he described himself as a functioning alcoholic and admitted that alcohol had affected his previous marriages, including his marriage to Thurman. He explained that while working, he could convince himself he was getting away with drinking because he could still remember his lines and perform professionally. But beneath that confidence, he knew something was wrong. The ability to continue working did not necessarily mean that everything in his private life was functioning normally. That admission changes the way the marriage can be viewed. It does not prove that alcohol alone destroyed the relationship. There is no responsible way to reduce a complicated marriage between two young actors to a single cause. Relationships rarely collapse because of one isolated problem. But it does establish something important. Oldman himself later acknowledged that drinking had damaged his personal life. And Thurman was living inside that period, experiencing the relationship not as a historical story but as her real life at a very young age. The public, however, saw something different. They saw two movie stars attending events together. They saw Thurman's extraordinary beauty and Oldman's unmistakable intensity. They saw a Hollywood romance developing during an era when celebrity marriages were routinely transformed into entertainment. The cameras captured the image, but they could not capture what was happening behind closed doors. And as the pressure increased, the difference between the public image and private reality became harder to ignore. Then the cracks became impossible to ignore. By 1992, the marriage had ended. Thurman was barely in her 20s, and Oldman's career was moving toward increasingly prominent roles. Their personal relationship was finished before either had reached the level of fame they would eventually achieve. That timing is crucial because neither person was yet the fully established star audiences would later recognize. The Gary Oldman remembered today, the Oscar-winning actor of Darkest Hour, Sirius Black, Commissioner Gordon, and countless other roles, was still decades away. The Uma Thurman audiences would later associate with Pulp Fiction, and Kill Bill was also still emerging. They were not the finished versions of themselves. They were two ambitious young performers trying to discover who they were while already carrying the expectations of Hollywood. Years afterward, Thurman looked back without pretending the marriage had been something it wasn't. In her 1996 Vanity Fair interview, she called it a mistake but also described it as a passionate first love that ended as it needed to. That combination is revealing. She did not erase the love. She simply refused to confuse love with permanence. A relationship can be meaningful and still fail. A first love can be genuine and still belong to a chapter of life that eventually has to close. And Oldman's later comments were even more striking. He would eventually describe one of his marriages as lasting for 10 minutes, and say he did not think it had meant very much to either person. For a relationship that once led to marriage, that sounded almost brutal. Yet perhaps the most important question was not simply why they divorced. It was what each of them learned afterward. Because the marriage ended in 1992, but the consequences of that period would follow Oldman for years, and eventually force him to confront a problem far more dangerous than a failed romance. The easiest version of the story is that Gary Oldman and Uma Thurman simply married too young, discovered they were incompatible, and walked away. There is truth in that explanation, but it is incomplete. Behind the failed marriage was a period in Oldman's life when alcohol had begun taking control, even as his professional reputation continued rising. Years later, he would acknowledge that drinking had affected his previous marriages and other parts of his life. That admission matters because it gives context without pretending to provide a single explanation for everything that happened. A marriage can be complicated by addiction, differences in age and experience, professional pressure, and personal growth all at once. None of those factors needs to stand alone to have a profound effect on two people. Oldman eventually described himself as a functioning alcoholic. That phrase captures the danger perfectly because it suggests how easily a serious problem can remain hidden when the person experiencing it is still capable of succeeding publicly. He could work. He could memorize lines. He could appear professional. He could continue building a career while privately struggling. And because Hollywood rewards people who can keep performing, the problem could remain hidden much longer than it might have elsewhere. Success can sometimes create the illusion that everything is under control, even when private life tells a very different story. For an actor whose profession depended on stepping in front of cameras and delivering convincing performances, the ability to maintain that professional image could make the underlying problem even harder to recognize. For Thurman, the situation was different. She was still developing emotionally and professionally. She had entered the relationship at 18 with Oldman 12 years older, and had described him as her first love. Looking backward from adulthood, she could recognize something that is difficult to understand while living through it. Intensity does not automatically equal compatibility. A relationship can feel overwhelming, exciting, and completely consuming without necessarily being capable of surviving the realities of everyday life. Youth can make emotions feel permanent because everything is being experienced for the first time. But as people grow older, their understanding of themselves changes, and sometimes the things that once seemed impossible to live without become part of a past they can finally understand from a distance. Their marriage lasted only a short time, but the end did not mean that every memory became meaningless. That is one of the most interesting contradictions in Thurman's later comments. She could call the marriage a mistake while simultaneously describing the romance as crazy, powerful, and deeply important because it was her first love. Those ideas can coexist. A relationship can matter enormously and still be wrong. A person can love someone and eventually understand that staying with them is impossible. And sometimes the most honest ending is not a dramatic betrayal, but the realization that two people have become different versions of themselves. The relationship may have been real, the feelings may have been real, and yet the future they once imagined together may no longer make sense. The early 1990s also brought major professional changes. Thurman was moving toward the role that would transform her career. In 1994, Pulp Fiction turned her into an international star, earning her an Academy Award nomination and making Mia Wallace one of the most recognizable characters of the decade. Suddenly, the actress who had once been known primarily for her unusual beauty and early performances was at the center of one of the most influential films of the era. Her career was no longer simply promising. It was becoming culturally significant. Oldman's career was moving in another direction entirely. His willingness to inhabit unstable, dangerous, and psychologically complicated characters was making him one of Hollywood's most distinctive performers. He was rarely interested in playing safe or predictable roles, and that intensity became one of the qualities that separated him from many of his contemporaries. Their divorce, therefore, happened before the public had fully discovered what both actors would become. That is why the marriage can feel almost surreal in retrospect. It belongs to an earlier Hollywood, before Thurman became Mia Wallace, before Oldman became Winston Churchill, and before either actor had the cultural status they would eventually possess. But the personal consequences were real. Oldman entered rehabilitation during the 1990s and began confronting his alcoholism. In a 1995 Los Angeles Times interview, he confirmed that he had gone to alcohol rehabilitation and specifically acknowledged that drinking had adversely affected his marriages to Leslie Manville and Uma Thurman. He also described sobriety as something a person ultimately had to choose for themselves. That was a crucial turning point because now the story was no longer simply about a failed Hollywood marriage. It was about a man being forced to confront the behavior that had helped damage his private life. Years later, Oldman would describe his drinking in even darker terms, recalling that he could sweat vodka and that addiction was hell. He had undergone 2 stints in rehab and eventually became sober. The language he used when discussing that period suggested that he was no longer looking at addiction as an abstract problem belonging to someone else. He was acknowledging it as something that had affected his own choices, his relationships, and the life he was trying to build. The marriage to Thurman was already over by then, but the experience had become part of a much larger reckoning. And that is where the story becomes more complicated than the headline suggests. Because the brutal confession was not simply that the marriage failed. It was that, years later, both people could look backward and acknowledge that the relationship belonged to a version of themselves they had eventually outgrown. Thurman continued forward and built a career that would make her one of the defining actresses of her generation. Oldman confronted his addiction, continued working, and eventually reached a level of recognition that few could have predicted during those early years. Their paths separated, but the lessons of that period did not simply disappear. The question now was whether that past would continue defining them, or whether they could finally leave it there. Hollywood has a habit of turning old relationships into permanent mythology. Two famous people meet, they fall in love, they marry, something goes wrong, and decades later, the public still wants to know exactly what happened. The story becomes larger than the people who actually lived it, especially when both individuals eventually become much more famous than they were when they first met. Gary Oldman and Uma Thurman's marriage fits that pattern perfectly. Their relationship has continued to attract curiosity because it happened so early in both careers, long before audiences fully understood who these two actors would eventually become. Except neither person eventually offered the clean, sensational explanation audiences might have expected. Instead, their later comments were surprisingly restrained, leaving a story that is far more complicated than the dramatic version Hollywood often prefers. Thurman did not spend her life publicly attacking Oldman. In 1996, several years after the divorce, she looked back on the relationship with an unusual mixture of honesty and distance. She said they had met when she was 18, noted the 12-year age difference, called it a crazy love affair, and described the marriage as a mistake. But she also called Oldman a truly great actor and acknowledged that he had been her first love. That distinction is important because she was not rewriting the entire relationship as fake. She was not claiming that every emotion she experienced had been an illusion. Instead, she was recognizing something many people only understand after years have passed. What feels right at one stage of life does not necessarily remain right forever. A person can look back at an old relationship and acknowledge its importance without wanting to return to it. She was saying that what felt right at 18 did not necessarily remain right later. At 18, Thurman was still at the beginning of adulthood, and the experiences that followed would inevitably change her. Careers develop, personalities mature, priorities shift, and people begin to see themselves differently. A marriage entered during one version of a person's life may eventually become incompatible with the person they grow into. That does not automatically make the original decision foolish. It simply means that life continued moving after the decision was made. Oldman's later comments were colder. According to reports on his 2014 Playboy interview, he said he did not think the marriage had meant very much to either of them. That sentence is probably the closest thing to the brutal confession promised by the headline. It sounds harsh because marriage is normally remembered as something significant, especially when two people later become internationally recognized stars. But even that statement needs context. It does not mean there was never affection. It does not mean the relationship was entirely meaningless. And it certainly does not prove that one person alone was responsible for its collapse. What it reveals is how dramatically memory can change when decades separate someone from the person they once were. For Thurman, the relationship remained significant because it was her first great love. For Oldman, looking back after several marriages and decades of life, it appears to have become a much smaller chapter. That difference may actually explain why the story has remained fascinating. The two people were remembering the same marriage from completely different distances. One memory was connected to the emotional intensity of first love, while the other seemed shaped by the accumulated experiences of a much longer adult life. Neither perspective necessarily erases the other. They simply demonstrate how differently two people can carry the same history. There was another uncomfortable truth. Oldman's drinking had been part of his life during that era, and he later acknowledged that alcohol adversely affected his marriages. By the 1990s, he was beginning the difficult process of confronting his addiction. His 1995 interview makes clear that rehabilitation was not simply a public relations exercise. He understood sobriety as something he needed to choose for himself. That detail matters because addiction does not always announce itself through obvious collapse. Sometimes a person continues working, continues appearing successful, and continues convincing themselves that everything is manageable while the consequences slowly spread into the most private areas of their life. Later, Oldman described his addiction with even greater bluntness. He said he had been a functioning alcoholic for the first 2 decades of his adult life and recalled how easily he could rationalize his drinking because he was still working. Eventually, however, denial stopped working. He entered rehab twice and became sober. That recovery does not rewrite the past. It does not erase the damage that may have occurred, and it does not transform every difficult moment into something with a neat explanation. But it changes its meaning. A failed marriage can sometimes become evidence of failure, something a person spends the rest of their life trying to hide. Or it can become evidence of what a person eventually had to change. Oldman went on to marry again, continue working, and build one of the most respected acting careers of his generation. Thurman likewise moved forward, becoming one of the defining actresses of American cinema in the 1990s and beyond. Their lives continued in different directions, and neither remained trapped in the identity they had possessed during their marriage. The young actors who once stood together in photographs eventually became people with entirely separate professional and personal histories. And perhaps that is the most revealing part of the story. The young couple photographed together in 1990 could not have known what was coming. They could not have known how famous they would become. They could not have known how differently they would remember each other. And they certainly could not have known that decades later, their brief marriage would still be used as a window into the lives they eventually left behind. But there was still one final question. If both stars eventually accepted that the marriage was a mistake, what should we actually remember about it? The final truth about Gary Oldman and Uma Thurman's marriage may be less scandalous than the headline suggests, and far more human. They were young, they were ambitious, they were surrounded by the pressure and excitement of Hollywood, and they fell in love quickly. They married quickly, too. But eventually, they realized something that many people only understand after experiencing it themselves. Love alone is not always enough to build a lasting life together. Sometimes 2 people can genuinely care for each other and still reach a point where continuing the relationship no longer makes sense. Thurman was 18 when she met Oldman, 12 years her senior. They married in 1990 and divorced in 1992. Years later, she described the relationship as a crazy love affair and called the marriage a mistake, while still acknowledging that Oldman had been her first love. Those descriptions may seem contradictory at first, but they actually reveal how complicated memory can become. Calling the marriage a mistake did not necessarily mean that every emotion surrounding it had been a mistake. The love could have been real. The excitement could have been real. The importance of that first relationship could have been real. What changed was Thurman's understanding of what that relationship ultimately meant for her life. Oldman remembered it differently. His later remark that he did not think the marriage meant very much to either of them sounds harsh, especially when compared with Thurman's description of the relationship as her first love. But it also illustrates something uncomfortable about relationships. 2 people can share the same years, the same home, the same experiences, and still remember those years in completely different ways. One person may remember the emotional intensity, while another remembers the relationship as a brief chapter that eventually faded into the background. Neither memory necessarily gives us the complete story. There is no need to invent a secret betrayal to make that story powerful. The documented facts are already complicated enough. Oldman was struggling with alcohol during that period. He later acknowledged that drinking had adversely affected his marriages, and he eventually entered rehabilitation and became sober. By 2021, he had been sober for decades and spoke openly about the destructive nature of addiction. That history gives the marriage a deeper context, but it should not be turned into a simplistic explanation that places every problem on one issue. A relationship involving 2 young people can be affected by many pressures at once, And addiction can become one of the forces making an already difficult situation even harder to manage. That may be the most important part of the story, because the marriage did not become the end of either person's life. It became one chapter among many. For Thurman, the years that followed brought extraordinary professional success. Pulp Fiction transformed her career, and later roles established her as a major Hollywood star. The actress who had entered the relationship as a teenager eventually became an internationally recognized performer whose image and performances would become deeply connected to the cinema of the 1990s and beyond. For Oldman, the trajectory was equally remarkable. He continued taking demanding roles, survived periods of personal instability, and eventually became an Oscar-winning actor whose career stretched across generations. The same performer who had already developed a reputation for intensity would eventually inhabit some of the most memorable characters in modern cinema. His later accomplishments do not erase the difficult periods of his younger life, but they demonstrate that a troubled chapter does not have to become the final definition of a person. The people who married in 1990 were not the people who became famous decades later. They changed. Their careers changed. Their experiences changed. Their understanding of themselves changed. And perhaps the real lesson is that change can make an old relationship impossible to recognize. A person can look at something they once desperately wanted and eventually understand why it could not continue. That realization does not require hatred. Sometimes it simply requires distance. When Thurman later called the marriage a mistake, she did not erase the young woman who had fallen in love. She simply acknowledged that the woman she became understood the decision differently. The older Thurman had knowledge that the 18-year-old Thurman could not possibly have possessed. She knew herself better. She understood relationships differently. She had lived through professional success, personal challenges, and the ordinary process of becoming an adult. Looking backward, she could recognize both the sincerity of the love and the limitations of the decision. When Oldman spoke about the marriage with distance, he was also speaking from a completely different stage of life. He had experienced other relationships, professional triumphs, personal struggles, and a long battle with addiction. His perspective was inevitably shaped by everything that came after 1992. The marriage could not possibly occupy the same emotional space it once had. Time had changed the meaning of it. There is something almost fitting about that. Their relationship began during a period of acceleration. Both careers were moving forward. Hollywood was opening its doors. Their lives were becoming larger. But privately, they were still figuring out how to live. And sometimes the hardest lessons arrive before people have the experience to understand them. Young people can make decisions with complete sincerity while lacking the perspective that only time can provide. Today, the marriage is little more than a footnote in two enormous careers. But that footnote reveals something that glamorous celebrity stories often hide. Fame does not make people emotionally prepared. Talent does not make someone immune to addiction. And falling deeply in love does not guarantee that two people are ready to build a life together. Celebrity status can make a relationship more visible, but it does not make the people inside it any less human. Gary Oldman's later sobriety became one of the most important transformations of his personal life. His own descriptions of addiction show how destructive that period had been, while also demonstrating that a person can eventually confront the behavior that once controlled them. Uma Thurman's later career shows another form of transformation. She became far more than the young actress who once married a celebrated British performer. Both continued forward even though they did so separately. Their marriage ended decades ago. The memories remained, but neither stayed there. And perhaps that is the real truth behind Gary Oldman and Uma Thurman's brief, turbulent marriage. It was not a secret Hollywood tragedy waiting to be uncovered. It was a very human relationship between two young people who loved each other, made a decision before they fully understood themselves, and eventually discovered that growing apart could be just as real as falling in love. Which moment in their story surprised you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story gave you a different perspective on two Hollywood stars you thought you knew, like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more untold celebrity stories.